Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. When you combine the casualties of the Union side as well as the Confederate sides, and you add them both together, and you consider the combat deaths and the non-combat deaths that came about of it, the United States Civil War was and remains the deadliest war in United States history because both sides of it are Americans. Today we're going to see the tide of the war change as the war for the Union moves from, kind of a Confederate victories early to a Union victories as the war progresses. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's A-Push. History class rides again! We have two objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to, number 12, identify the military and political turning points of the war. Or maybe that's number 11. Man, my numbering is off. Anyway, you should be able to identify the military and political turning points of the war. Identifying a turning point is sort of a classic A-push skill where it looks like the momentum is moving in one direction and then suddenly or incrementally the tide turns and it goes in a different direction. Today we're going to talk about a couple of those pieces that turn the war in favor of the Union, in favor of the United States. And then you're going to be able to summarize the reason that Union forces were able to get the Confederacy to go surrender. But let's begin in our first Roman numeral. Number 11? Maybe it's number 12. I don't know. We'll see. Okay, so I just looked into it, and it turns out my numbering is both. We're both in number 12 and 11 as the Roman numerals got a little off bumpus, but that's the way it appears in your packets, and we're just going to roll with it. So Roman numeral number 11 for objective number 12. And here we're going to talk about our first of the turning points of 1863. So Lincoln, when he took office, was against slavery, but not really, I think, in a position to change it, and certainly rhetorically not interested in ending slavery. This is one of those things that, I think tarnishes Lincoln's reputation today, that he doesn't come out on a bolder stance against slavery earlier and stick with it for a longer period of time. I think it also gives us a little bit of insight into Lincoln himself. Lincoln, like a lot of great presidents, doesn't believe in picking fights he can't win, and sees that ending slavery is way beyond his capacity in 1860 and certainly in 1862. But by 1863, I think we're seeing Lincoln evolve on this issue. Because at the outset of the war, Lincoln invoked the time-honored tradition of Northern values to go mobilize public support. He referred to American democracy as the whole family of man. And it's a great piece of Lincolnian rhetoric. Still, though, Lincoln insisted that slavery was irrelevant to this conflict between North and South. And he did so, I think, maybe fearing that the four border states of Missouri, Maryland, Kentucky, and Delaware would go and secede from the Union and go join the Confederate side if he takes too hard of a stance on this. He also tried to build broad support in the North, and while the North doesn't have slaves, it's not like they're totally against the idea because it's a complicated issue and you can't really speak for a whole region at one time. And abolishing slavery would jeopardize both goals. It could really destabilize the economy in both the North and the South and lose his support for that whole family of man that he was hoping for. Though in 1861, before the war had really escalated, Congress had adopted a resolution proposed by Senator John Crittenden of Kentucky, which affirmed that the Union had no intention of interfering with slavery. That policy unraveled pretty quickly, and the military began treating escaped slaves as contraband of war. Now, contraband of war is this property of military value, and it would be subject to confiscation. So it's like you're fighting an enemy, and even though that's not your stuff that you took from them, it has military value, and you're going to seize it and hold it, at least until the war is over. And they're saying that, slaves, while the condition of ownership of a human is being challenged in the 1860s, certainly the South thinks of a slave as property. And so in the North, when escaped slaves come up there, they say, okay, we'll call you contraband and not make you subject to the Fugitive Slave Act, and we'll hold you in this place. As war casualties mounted through 1862, Lincoln and some Republican leaders began to accept the arguments of people like Frederick Douglass that this war should really be understood as a struggle against slavery and the nature of freedom itself. In April of 1862, Congress, which by this point would be influenced on a group of the Republican Party. So the Republican Party is still a new political party, and there's essentially two factions to it. You have the more conservative Republicans, which are are interested in like advancing the cause of the Republican Party, but you also have the radicals in the Republican Party, which are the Republican parties are the fire eaters of the Republican side. They're the anti-slavery, burn it all down, punish the South. They're really the hardliners on it, these radical Republicans. And Congress came under the influence of the radical Republicans in 1862. And so they enacted this legislation ending slavery in the District of Columbia, saying like, hey, this is an area that Washington, D.C., the city is under direct control of Congress, and even though it's a southern city and has slaves, boom, in April of 1862, they outlawed slavery there. And in June, they enacted the Wilmot Proviso, which we talked about in a couple of previous classes. In July of 1862, the Second Confiscation Act, there they say that any of the fugitive slaves who are captured by the Union Army are going to be forever free. And so basically, if a slave can make it to the Union side, if they can escape from the South and the Confederacy and make it to the Union side, they won't be subject to the Fugitive Slave Clause that, boom, they are forever free. Subpoint C. Since slavery stood at the foundation of the Southern economy, anti-slavery Northerners insisted that emancipation was necessary. And it was necessary even at the cost of its economic destabilization, because that economic destabilization was enabling the South's ability to continue, and that freeing the slaves then would weaken the South's ability to sustain the war. So then slavery, if you accept it as an economic argument, saying like not only should we ban slavery for whatever civil rights reasons, we also do it because that way we can go and cripple our enemy and actually go win this conflict. Throughout 1861 and 1862, Lincoln actually had a hard time retaining control of this emancipation issue. Even though he's the president and policy usually comes through the White House, policy was moving faster than Lincoln could really keep a hold of it. Take, for instance, the Union General John C. Fremont. We've met Fremont before. He's the guy that led the California Bear Flag Rebellion. Union General John C. Fremont issued a proclamation freeing all the slaves in Missouri in August of 1861. Now, Lincoln looks at this, and I think by this point, Lincoln is really considering freeing slavery altogether and eliminating the practice. But he looks at what Fremont does in Missouri, trying to put down a rebellion in Missouri. And Lincoln says, actually, we need to walk that one back, Fremont. And Lincoln goes and rescinds that order. And why does he do it? It's because Missouri is a border state that was threatening to join the Confederacy. And Lincoln wants to keep as many people as he can on the side of the North back in the United States as possible. So fearing the negative impact on loyal border states, Lincoln actually rescinds Fremont's order and re-enslaves those people. Lincoln proposed gradual emancipation, though, and saying okay, these border states, slavery's days are numbered, so let's figure out how to do a gradual emancipation. And then also colonization, feeling that black people just really couldn't stay in America. So a colonization somewhere else, probably Africa, because the Liberia movement was there, for any of the border slave states. Subpoint D. Lincoln initially opposed emancipation as a war goal. So initially he's like, no, we're not fighting for ending slavery. But cautiously, during the summer of 1862, Lincoln concluded that emancipation had become a political and military necessity. But he delayed on announcing that until there was a Union victory. Lincoln didn't want to look like it was a desperate move, so he needed a pretty good war win first, and then he could go announce that emancipation was the real goal. And that war victory happened in Antietam. And on September 22nd, 1862, just 5 days after the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln issued a preliminary proclamation of emancipation on September 2nd. There he offered rebel states to return to the Union before January of 1863, and if they could do that, so border states, if you come back to the Union before January of 1863, then we will readmit you and you can keep slavery, and if you don't, and then we're going to ban slavery, and then you've lost your chance to go do so. The Northern reaction to this preliminary Emancipation Proclamation was not encouraging. And what happened was in the North, Democrats won big in those elections. The proclamation didn't immediately free all the slaves in the South. It had continued to authorize slavery in the border states, and in areas under Union control and under Indian territory. So those things were all allowed to continue to have their slaves. He signed that Emancipation Proclamation on January 3rd of 1863, and it declared slaves in the Confederate-held territories to be free. It didn't bring full emancipation. Basically says that in the theater of war, where there was still an ongoing war, Lincoln there declares those slaves to be free. It's kind of an interesting proposition. If you accepted the fact that the Confederacy is seceding and becoming its own country, then the President of the United States can issue whatever proclamations he wants, and they just don't seem to apply there. And it doesn't free the slaves in any of the slaveholding states that are still in the Union. And there are, four of these that are still in the Union, still have slave states, and they don't free slaves there. The reality is the Emancipation Proclamation actually freed very few people. It was more of a rhetorical position that comes up. But why does he do it only in the states which are currently a theater of war? I think it's because that Lincoln is acting in his capacity as commander-in-chief. The Constitution really does put some pretty clear limits on what the president can do on state matters, and slavery was seen as one of those state matters from early as the Dred Scott case. So I think Lincoln is really operating there in his constitutional capacity for the Emancipation Proclamation. It's a bold move. It's a historic moment. The reality is that it doesn't change the life of too many slaves. But it does change the nature of the war, and that's really the issue. Union troops now became agents of liberation. They weren't just going and fighting to preserve the Union. They were still doing that, but now they also become freedom fighters that go and free enslaved people. Despite the limitations of the Emancipation Proclamation, it set off these scenes of jubilation among free black people in the North and among abolitionists in the North and the contrabands among the slaves in the South. The proclamation, of course, is controversial in the South, as well as in the North, and Democrats on both sides feared that, now we're going to have like a race war and racial warfare and competition for employment, and this is going to open up a whole new can of worms. Subpoint E. Of the proclamation's provisions, few were more radical in their implications than the enrollment of black people into military service. Basically, the Emancipation Proclamation allowed black people to go join the military forces. It changed the popular thinking, and it also changed military policy. Some northern white people were arguing that if black people came into the Union and they benefited from a Union victory, then they should share in the fighting and dying along the way. Lincoln initially refused to accept black people into the military draft. And by 1862, black people had formed volunteer regiments to come join on their own in New England and South Carolina and Louisiana and my favorite state of Kansas. As white resistance to conscription increased, African Americans volunteered for the Union Army, and 24,000 people joined the Union Navy, and 180,000 of them joined the Union Army. Military service, though, and this is important to remember, doesn't end racial discrimination. Basically, though, African Americans still volunteer for the military service in disproportionate numbers to what white people were volunteering for military service. And within the Army, black soldiers, they didn't receive the same treatment as white soldiers. There's very clearly a racial divide between the two races. The Navy was a little bit different, and I think it's sort of the nature of the Navy, and everybody's just on the same boat. They receive, basically the same treatment as white soldiers, and I really do think it's the conditions of the Navy that make that possible. For black soldiers, military service proved to be a liberating experience. At least 130 former soldiers would go on to go serve in political office after the Civil War. Subpoint F. In 1862, Democrats gained seats in Congress as popular support for a growing negotiated peace to go into the Civil War that way. General Lee's army was defeating Union forces at Fredericksburg by December of 1862 and Chancellorsville in May of 1863, and that further eroded for Northern support from the war. It just looked like the South was going to win enough of these battles. General Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, he aimed to split the Confederacy. This was kind of his plan. As McClellan got fired and replaced, Lincoln had to go turn to Grant as basically the only person that was having success in the battlefield, and Ulysses S. Grant becomes the de facto commander of all the Union forces. So he aimed to split the Confederacy and search for a decisive victory in which he could show some success. Vicksburg, Mississippi surrendered the Union on July 4th of 1863, followed by Port Hudson, Louisiana, and 5 days days later, that established Union control over the entire Mississippi River, and it allowed basically shipping to go up and down the river, and it split the way that basically it takes the Union forces and splits the western side of the Confederacy from there. Grant had cut off Louisiana and Arkansas and Texas from the rest of the Confederacy, and hundreds of slaves deserted their plantations, seeing that like the end looked like it was in sight, at least in those western areas. General Lee on the Confederacy side, he suggested instead of sending the army to Tennessee, the Confederacy should go invade the North and go take the fight up onto Union territory as well. And then they could go and move east to go get some easier battlefields that would break the North's will to fight. And so Lee says, you know, if we're kind of losing down in the South, then let's go take the battle up on the Union side, and we'll draw Union forces up into their territory instead of in ours, and maybe we could go turn popular support, turn that more and more in favor of ending the war. Grant won a Union victory at Vicksburg, Mississippi in July of 1863. Vicksburg was the last major Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. And Grant, when he takes Vicksburg, does it by laying siege on the city for 6 weeks. And after 6 weeks of facing starvation, the city surrendered, and more or less Grant takes Vicksburg without having to go storm the city and go face combat. Subpoint G. So then Lee is going and advancing his idea of moving into the North, and he advanced on a northern soil in Pennsylvania. There he was held back by Union forces under the command of General George Meade at the Battle of Gettysburg in July of 1863. Lee commanded Pickett to go charge up this hill onto Union troops, saying like basically we need to go take that hill along the way, and that's a real disastrous move. I mean, the high ground is always better, just easier to see people come approaching onto it. It gives one side the advantage of like shooting down versus shooting up. And when Lee gives Pickett this, go charge on that hill, Pickett's like, this is a suicide mission. Are you sure? And Lee's like, we're going to need that hill. It was Lee's greatest blunder. Pickett's charge was a massacre, a very predictable massacre. And Lee really blamed himself for those losses for a long time. And I think military historians agree that was a bad move. It was still, though, Gettysburg was an unexpected battle, and truly kind of an unnecessary one. And it was, had 50,000 casualties. It becomes the bloodiest battle in U.S. history. At the dedication of the Union Cemetery there at Gettysburg, Lincoln used the moment to go reframe the war. He says, we've been losing a lot of lives, and popular support has really been waning on this. And, now this has become a war for freedom, not just a war of retaining the Union. And Lincoln really uses this moment to go reframe how the Civil War is going to be carried out. His Gettysburg Address identified the nation's mission, like why we exist as a country, with the principle of that all men are created equal. And Lincoln goes back and takes that Declaration of Independence, the rhetoric of Thomas Jefferson, a Southerner, who gives us this soaring rhetoric of it, and he says, this is what we're fighting for. It's a brilliant rhetorical move. It's a masterstroke in the Gettysburg Address, while Lincoln himself was kind of unimpressed with it in the moment, remains one of the single greatest pieces of American rhetorical work ever. Union victories at Gettysburg and at Vicksburg are considered major turning points for the war. Republicans reaped political gains in their elections there afterwards. Confederate elections went sharply against any politician who supported Jefferson Davis. So it looks like the North is putting its political act back together, but in the South it's political fracture. The Confederates' defeats ended their prospect of winning any foreign recognition and acquiring advanced weapons from the British. British manufacturers, they were no longer dependent on Southern cotton. However, they were dependent on the North for cheap wheat. The British were championing abolitionism, and they wanted to avoid provoking a war with the well-armed northern United States. Subpoint H. In 1863, Lincoln begins to figure out how we're going to end this war and bring the Union back together, and how do we sew up the rips that are tearing apart the fabric. In 1863, Lincoln announced his 10% plan for Reconstruction. This is really like the first approach, I think, to figuring out what America is going to look like in a post-war era. And his 10% plan was really a pretty lenient plan of readmission. Leniency was given to the South with full restoration of rights and property, other than slaves, but otherwise, like, we'll get you back in and go be proper Americans again, of anybody who would go swear an oath of loyalty to the Union. And when 10% of the state would go swear this oath, the states could then elect a new state government. The new state government would be required to abolish slavery, but with 10% of the people saying they want to be, back in the Union again, let's get this thing going. It's a pretty forgiving plan, and I think you really see Lincoln's magnanimity on this one, that he wants to forgive and move on. When black people, they played no role in the 10% plan. They weren't considered citizens, so they basically they're not considered in the 10%. Free black people in New Orleans, they complained about this 10% plan, and they found sympathy from radical Republicans in Congress, saying that, like, hey, this is not a good plan. This leaves far too many people in control. And so the free black people in New Orleans, the most important city in the South, along with the radical Republicans in Congress, they pass a different bill known as the Wade-Davis bill as an alternate plan. This required a majority of the states, not 10%, but an absolute, but a real majority of the state's voters to go pledge their loyalty. And Lincoln approaches the Wade-Davis bill with a legislative trick known as a pocket veto, where he says, okay, well, I've got this, and if I veto it, it looks like I'm against, that was a loud sound. He said, if I veto this, then that means it looks like I'm against people in my own political party, and I might disrupt the loyalty of black people in the South. But if I accept it, then I'm turning back, and maybe I'm creating too high of a bar to actually get the states back in. So Lincoln does what's known as a pocket veto, where he just lets it sit on his desk. He's like, took the bill and stuck it in his pocket, and just waited for Congress to go adjourn, and then the bill just sort of disappears without ever being heard from again. He doesn't actually have to veto it, but it doesn't become a law. It's a pocket veto. Roman numeral number 12. Here I want to talk about how the Union actually secures its victory in 1864 and 1865. And I think this comes when Lincoln finally figures out his commander corps and gets competent generals in place. He puts Ulysses S. Grant in charge of all Union armies, and then he directs them to go advance against all the major Confederate forces at once. He's basically saying, like, all these little pinprick moments, like, no, we're going to go for the whole Confederacy at one time. He wanted a decisive victory before 1864, when Lincoln has to go face re-election. And he's doing this as it looks like, politics is pretty uncertain. Ulysses S. Grant, he knew how to fight a modern war that relied on technology and focused on an entire society to go do so. Grant's really the first one to go figure out, hey, we've got modern weapons. We don't have to go do the old-fashioned war times that we've been doing at once. He was willing to accept heavy casualties if he had to, and assaults on strongly defended positions, in the belief that the attempts that earlier Union commanders were worrying about conserving the lives of their soldiers, which is a noble goal, but if it prolongs the fight, then I think Grant says, like, we're not winning this war, and we're going to have to win it pretty, it's time to stop being cautious all the time. Lee was narrowly victorious, so the South, Robert E. Lee was narrowly victorious in the battles of the Wilderness and Spotsylvania Courthouse. At Cold Harbor, Grant severely eroded Lee's forces, though. So at Cold Harbor, Grant goes and they kill a lot of Confederate soldiers in this. However, Grant lost actually more people. Grant's army was bigger. They had more soldiers. He had more to lose. So, I mean, if you're looking at a percentage, it's a different way to look at it, but man, Grant got some people killed. So point B. In 1864, Grant began a war of attrition against Lee's army in Virginia. A war of attrition just basically means like wearing them down over a long time. Like a war of attrition is a long way to fight. Union and Confederate soldiers suffered through protracted trench warfare at Richmond. At the end of 6 weeks of fighting, Grant's casualties stood at 60,000 people in Richmond. Almost the entire size of Lee's army, Grant got killed. Lee had lost 30,000 men, so he's suffering, as a percentage-wise, huge casualties too. The enormous casualties, Grant, for similar conditions in Petersburg and in June, laid siege to the city there, saying that, like, we're just going to have to take a whole city just like we did in Vicksburg. The enormous casualties and military stalemate, it threatened Lincoln with electoral defeat in 1864. You know, he's got a commander now that's actually winning, but he's winning at tremendous losses. And Lincoln's like, man, I got to go stand for re-election against some of these people. To go punish farmers who provided a food base for Lee's army, Grant ordered General Philip Sheridan to go turn the region into a barren waste, saying, like, as we advance into the South, if there's farms that are making food, burn the farms. If there are animals which are being used as livestock, kill the animals. You have to really cripple this army. And the South was already having food supply problems as well. And any other resource useful for the Confederates, we need to crush them. That was the Grant approach. His decision to carry the war then to Confederate civilians. I mean, now you have the military going and attacking farmers who are not soldiers, right? But they're participating in a war effort because they're sending off troops. This takes the war to civilians, and that changed the nature of the war. It makes it far uglier, subpoint C. And here I want to introduce a political movement known as the National Union Party. In June of 1864, the Republican Convention endorsed Lincoln's war measures. So the Republicans say, hey, this is tough, but it's a tough war. It's a total war, and everybody's in on it. They endorsed Lincoln's war measures. They demanded the surrender of the Confederacy and called for a constitutional amendment to go abolish slavery. The Republican Party temporarily renamed itself the National Union Party and then nominated Andrew Johnson for vice president. So we see a political split between one part of the Republican Party who's supporting Lincoln and another part of the Republican Party is splitting off and nominating Andrew Johnson for vice president. And this is interesting because Andrew Johnson is a Democrat. He's not a Republican, but they basically say this is the guy that we want to be vice president. Some radical Republicans nominated John C. Fremont on a platform of calling for a constitutional amendment to go abolish slavery, the federal protection of freed people's rights, and a confiscation of land of leading Confederates. So we see that Republican Party split. There's the radicals that are saying Fremont's our man on this one. The Democrats divided into the war Democrats who wanted to continue the fighting and the peace Democrats who wanted an immediate end of the fighting. They nominate George McClellan, who was Lincoln's first great general of the Potomac. And McClellan promised to recommend an immediate armistice and a peace convention if he was going to be elected. Subpoint D. In July of 1864, William Tecumseh Sherman, one of Lincoln's generals, settled into a siege of the city of Atlanta. He started shelling the city and setting off raids to go cut off his supply lines to go do so. Atlanta was not the biggest city in the South at the time, but it's still an important city, and it's a rail hub that basically everybody goes through. And Sherman goes and takes the rail hub of Atlanta, the most kind of important city in that corner of the Confederacy, and he basically surrounds the city and nobody in or out to go lay siege on it. With supply lines severed, the Confederate General John Bell Hood pulled his troops out of Atlanta the next day, and September 1st, destroying supply depots as he left. So John Bell Hood pulls out of Atlanta and he says well, the Union isn't going to have this as well, and they destroyed supply depots to go prevent them from falling into Union hands. He also set fire to 81 loaded ammunition cars that led into this huge exploding conflagration. Could be watched by hundreds of people. I mean, it was an ammunition cars that they set on fire to go destroy the ammunition, so the Union side couldn't get it when they abandoned the city. The next day, on September 2nd, Confederates entered the city. They asked for protection to non-combatants and private property. Sherman sent a telegram to Washington, D.C. on September 3rd saying that Atlanta is ours and it was fairly won. Sherman's success resulted in celebrations in the North and deep pessimism in the Confederacy. Taking Atlanta really broke the will of the Confederacy. McClellan's abandonment of the peace platform and Republican empowerment and taking Atlanta was not only an important military position, it was this huge political relief for Lincoln and the Republicans of the North. Sherman's success resulted in that victory to do so. Bolstered by the victory, Lincoln won a victory in November. He wins office, wins re-election, becomes a president to win election during a civil war to go do so. Republicans increased their majorities in Congress. The pace of emancipation then at this point really starts to pick up. Maryland and Missouri freed their slaves, followed by Tennessee and Arkansas and Louisiana. And in July 31st of 1865, the Republican-dominated Congress approved the 13th Amendment, which prohibited slavery throughout the United States. So the 13th Amendment of the Constitution passes, and boom, slavery's over. I mean, you've still got the ones in the South that think of themselves as their own country, but there's enough that the Constitutional Amendment passes. Basically, if the northern states are going to vote on it, there's enough of them, and slavery is outlawed with the 13th Amendment. Oh, lucky 13. Subpoint E. Sherman's philosophy, so basically after taking Atlanta, Sherman has his next policy to go slam the door on the South and entirely cut them off from whatever supply lines they could do. And his philosophy defined civilians as enemy combatants. He basically says that in a total war, even the soldiers are the obvious enemy, but even civilians, because they participate in the system, are enemy combatants, and they're considered a fair target for war. He declined to follow the Confederate Army into Tennessee. So basically the Confederacy wants to go bait Sherman and go pull them into the interior, more into Tennessee, and he basically doesn't take their bait. Instead, he turns the other direction after the capture of Atlanta. After burning Atlanta, Sherman marched his army from Atlanta to South Carolina in November through December of 1864, in what's known as Sherman's March to the Sea. And this is an absolutely savage move by Sherman to do so. He destroyed railroads and property and supplies in a 300-mile march to the sea, scoring a major psychological victory. I mean, he left a burned waste, just like literally burning the fields to go make sure that the South absolutely knows that a mile wide on either side, every barn, every house, every school building, every church, it was entirely destroyed to go slam the door. Sherman's March to the Sea was brutal and cruel, and it's not like Sherman is a masochist or he's not inhuman on it. He knows the weight of what he's doing, but he knows that this is the way to end the war. In February of 1865, Sherman invaded South Carolina with the desire to just absolutely wreak vengeance on the state where the secession had began. He issued a special field order number 15, setting aside hundreds of thousands of acres captured land for the exclusive use of freedom. Confederate soldiers, when he's coming through there, a lot of Confederate soldiers just deserted and fled home to go protect their farms and their families along the way. Sherman's move is absolute savagery, but it's absolutely what, slams the door on the South. Subpoint F. Because of the class resentment from poor white people, the Confederacy had a major manpower shortage that they were going to, so basically, because rich people didn't have to necessarily go fight in the war, the South was always kind of undermanned to go do so. And they take a desperate move in 1865 where they were going to start arming the slaves in exchange for their freedom, saying like, hey, if you'll go fight for our seceded country, then we'll free you from slavery. And go. The South, who had never wanted to give guns to their slaves, suddenly say, if you'll fight on our sides, here's a gun, and you'll be free. You'll no longer be a slave to go do so. There was a bold gamble, and it actually didn't come to fruition because the war ended before it had a chance to come to transpire. The war ended on April 9th of 1865 when Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. By May, the Confederate Army and the government had dissolved. For the South, the Union armies, they destroyed slavery, the Confederacy, and much of the South's economy. 260,000 Confederate soldiers paid for that secession with their lives. For the North, the struggle to preserve the Union kept the country intact, and it destroyed slavery. But the cost of victory was enormous in terms of money and resources and actual lives. 360,000 Union soldiers were dead and thousands more were maimed. The war had also set in motion a new industrial and financial order in the North. It hadn't entirely ended the sectional struggle. The North and the South would still be economically and philosophically opposed. Subpoint G. 5 days after Lee's surrender, Lincoln was assassinated. And he was assassinated by a well-known stage actor named John Wilkes Booth on April 14th of 1865 while attending the play Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. He was shot in the head as he watched the play, and Lincoln died the next day. He was the first United States president to be assassinated. His funeral and burial marked a long period of national mourning. The assassination was part of a larger conspiracy intended by John Wilkes Booth to go revive the Confederate cause by eliminating President Lincoln and by eliminating Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward. Beyond Lincoln's death, though, the plot failed. Seward was only wounded, and Johnson's would-be attacker lost his nerve and flaked out. After a dramatic initial escape, Booth was killed at the climax of a 12-day manhunt, and the co-conspirators were all hanged. And this would go set off the next major phase in American history. The Civil War was over, and Lincoln was dead. And now the process of Reconstruction, which had been, initially the 10% plan and then the Wade Davis plan, the job of Reconstruction would be handed off to Andrew Johnson, and Andrew Johnson is not of that same political party. Andrew Johnson's a Democrat, and he's a Democrat from a slave state, and he's going to manage the future of Reconstruction totally differently. And it's a fascinating story that I can't wait to tell you about. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.